So one treatment that I wanted to focus on is the one that for a misconception that I previously identified, and that is students think that ionic compounds, salts, are held together by shared electrons. And it's believed that this misconception is the result of ball and stick models being used to show ionic lattices. And this right here is an example of ball and stick model. Obviously, this is not the physical entity that a teacher would hold up in a classroom, but it is symbolic of one. And this is something that the literature definitively says is ineffective because it creates a very misguided notion of what salts actually look like at the molecular level. When you think of a lattice structure of a salt, of crystalline salt, you should think of positively and negatively charged spheres almost smushed together. And that might look something like this image below, where you've got some large anions right next to some smaller cations, and what is holding these differently charged ions together is their actual charge, the electrostatic force, the negatives and the positives attracting one another. You should notice that in this structure, it is clear that salts are orderly. And it is also clear that there is no such thing as a molecule of a salt. There are formula units. One might call this a formula unit of this salt. But the fact is that this anion is attracted to, right now, we see 4 different cations. And were this cube to be expanded, you would see each negative charge in a 1-to-1 ratio will be surrounded by 6 positive charges. That means that the attraction is spherical. It is in all directions, and it is not unidirectional as students often conceive it to be. So I've just gone back a slide. What I wanted to show you is that in the literature there are better models identified and actually lessons surrounding these new models that can help teachers avoid creating these misconceptions in students' minds, and they never become an issue. This particular model here can be made real with styrofoam balls of varying sizes held together by toothpicks, skewers, or glue. And this creates a very accurate model of what ionic bonding actually looks like at the molecular level. Now, another thing that I came across in my research is the fact that, yes, there are identified solutions for misconceptions that are identified as common, but what happens when a teacher comes across a misconception that is not identified in the literature as common? This is when it falls to that teacher's personal ingenuity to come up with a solution. In my research, what I found is that students were very excited about what they had learned in the previous unit, which focused on elements and compounds and mixtures, and they were trying to explain bonding through that lens. So what I had to do was to take a day to sort of step back and explain the relationship between elements, compounds, and mixtures to make sure, though, that students weren't jumping at the opportunity to provide answers that were correct in the previous unit. There were students who wanted to explain everything in terms of physical and chemical changes. And they were saying things like atoms can bond physically or chemically. The idea being that if one were to hold 2 atoms together, that would force them to physically bond rather than chemically. So we took a day back, stepped back, and sort of teased out these misconceptions, which we never would have done had I not interviewed the students, because multiple choice diagnostics never identified this as a possible misconception that students might generate. Now, some practical considerations. What I've found is that taking the time to build one unit about chemical bonding that was steeped in the literature of common student misconceptions of bonding and that was curtailed to the particular misconceptions that my students started with, required a large amount of time. And the fact is that that was a large amount of time for one chemistry class. These days, especially in New York City, teachers are given 3, even 4 preps. Each prep is another course in which teachers have to familiarize themselves with the literature, with the misconceptions that are in the literature, as well as the misconceptions that their students come in with, and then they're supposed to design curricula to address these misconceptions. Finally, it's been identified that labs and demonstrations are very effective in improving not only student learning, but heading off these misconceptions, or even allowing students to face evidence that forces them to change their conception of the world. But these labs, even if they are demonstrations, still require a large amount of setup time, even more so if the teacher has 3 or 4 different preps that require different demonstrations or different labs. And I think that for science teachers in particular, who are a wanted commodity, especially in quote-unquote high-need schools. There's an article in the Times recently about how minority students typically have science teachers with less experience in the classroom and less experience with science. This is a huge problem because, as Ingersoll has found or has published in the literature, teacher turnover is a huge problem, leading to a lot of discontinuity for our students. And the fact is that teachers have so many preps. Teaching the right way requires so much time. I think that it's impossible for us to not look at the requirements of being an effective teacher who is steeped in literature and not tie that to the high rate of teacher turnover. In the future, there are authors like Osman who are out there doing literature reviews to try and condense all of the research out there in a way that makes it far more easy to digest for a teacher, and with others of us trying to find gaps in the research, developing more diagnostic tools. It's possible that the gap between research and practice might be reduced. However, I think that in order to really equip teachers to be effective in the long term, there needs to be something far greater at hand. There needs to be more investment in cultivating these teachers throughout their undergraduate careers, more investment in making sure that teachers are allowed to do what it is that they know and do it well, rather than asking them to do 15 different things, to try and keep teachers in the classroom, to give them the time to really invest themselves in a solid curriculum. I hope that you have enjoyed this presentation. It's been a pleasure.